Hello everyone, thank you for joining. My name is Dmitry Vinik and I'm a developer advocate on the Facebook open source team. Today we'll talk about React Native and I'll try to bring from level of not knowing what React Native is all the way to you being comfortable with actually writing apps using React Native. So without further ado, let's get started. All right, thank you everyone again. As I mentioned, today's presentation is hands-on React Native from zero to hero, and obviously I'm gonna talk about React Native here. And without further ado, the first thing I always like to talk about is myself, basically introduce myself. What do I do? Quickly about myself, as I said, I'm an open source developer advocate, and we are primarily working on opensource.fb.com, where you can find our open source portfolio, our blog, recordings of our videos, our podcast. You can also go to our YouTube channel to see more videos like this presentation or our series Explain Like I'm 5, where we cover open source projects from Facebook. More importantly is that I am focusing primarily on mobile, which covers Android, iOS, and hybrid apps. So in particular, it means that I am responsible in talking about React Native. I do talk about projects like Litho, which helps you to build declarative UIs for Android. I also discuss projects like Fresco, where it manages images for Android, and projects like Flipper, which I also touch bases on, and helps people to debug mobile applications. But more important, again, is that I am passionate about open source, hence my title is Open Source Developer Advocate, and I'm excited to speak about one of the great open source projects from Facebook today at this conference. I always like to make sure that we have a clear goals in mind where we give a presentation like this. First thing first, I always like to establish basics of a project I'm discussing. In this particular instance, we'll talk about basics of React Native. Then we'll talk about essential tools for React Native development. And I obviously, throughout this presentation, I'll try to talk about this concept, learn once, write anywhere, that React is famous for, and hence the React Native comes into play for us to discuss. So the agenda that comes out of these goals is first of all, I'll basically cover React Native 101 and everything that goes along with that. Then we'll transition to developing with React Native and things like setup, development, having development environment, and how to build projects for React Native. We'll cover there as well. And then we'll discuss debugging, because it's not just about writing code, but it's also working with the code after the fact. And not any less important, testing, because projects and any application break, so we need to make sure we know how to catch those breaks. And that's where testing will come into play. So let's begin with React Native 101. And React Native as a whole, it's basically, to define it, it's a framework for building native applications with React. And lots of things go actually in this short sentence. What are the native applications, you might ask? And I'd like to define that because it will play a major role for us later in this presentation. Native apps, if I were to define them and taking this definition from elsewhere, native apps are written in the code preliminarily used for the device and its operating system. The meaning of this basically is that, let's say you're designing an app for Android, you're writing with the language that Android uses, like Kotlin or Java. For iOS, it's, let's say it's Swift or Objective-C, or if you're writing a low-level code for tvOS of some sort of Windows or macOS. Building applications with the language that those operating systems use is what native apps are famous for, and actually what defines them. So the operating systems like Android will be important, iOS, macOS, Windows, and even AR/VR devices. Like if you, let's say you're building an app for Oculus. And so I've defined the first part of this, the native application part, but it's the important thing here is React piece of the definition of what React Native is. And so React brings us back to a question of what's the history of React Native? Why was it created in the first place? And it all started with React. It was open source in 2013. And when it comes to React, again, this is important to understand before you actually talk about React Native. And React is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. It's basically allowing developers to have this approach of divide and conquering a problem that they're trying to solve for the web and React helps them to achieve that. And the way it's done is that React is very much declarative. It doesn't focus on how, it focuses on what. Meaning that you're not trying to go into intricate details of how something works. Instead, you're just calling it, let's say you're trying to build a navigation menu. Instead of going and managing individual pieces of navigation menu, you just invoke a component. And that's an important part of React. React is component-based. And basically, by having those individual pieces, independent pieces of functions, of components as I would call them, you can test them independently, you can combine them to create complex applications. And that's what, again, React is famous for, this divide and conquer approach, dividing components and then combine them. And it really led us to a path of having this understanding of learn once and write anywhere. Learning React once for the web, we wanted to bring this knowledge and this experience, great developer experience, to other operating systems, to native operating systems like Android, iOS, macOS, Windows, and even AR/VR. And that's what inspired React Native. But again, to give you just some insight, because it will play a major role, is to know what React is, or at least see how it looks like. And I'm going to give you a short demo. So let's take a look at that. So the best and the easiest way for me to describe you how React works is using this project, Create React App, which is also available on the Facebook GitHub org. And basically, if I scroll down, it will explain how it works. In this case, I just need to grab a couple of these terminal operations that I need to execute. And after I run them, it actually shows you how they look like. Obviously, they take some time for all dependencies to be installed. I'll just skip that for you and do it on my end and show you how the app looks like. But that's really the only thing I need to do. So one by one, I'll run this and get started. So I put you on pause for a second. After I run this, I have an app called My App. And again, let it all load. I'll bring you back when finishes creating these dependencies, installing these dependencies. So give it a second. All right, it's all done. Now let's open up our IDE. In my case, it's VS Code. All right, it's all great. So now let's take a look at the project. So you can see that under my source, you can find JS, CSS files, and tests as well. So this is basically how your simple app will look like. In this case, you can see that it's, again, the same thing you would see for React and non-React. Just a simple DOM. So let's launch it really quickly. So let's start the project and see how it looks like for us. Let it load. So this is basically the working app. And for me to quickly change it, let's say for conference, you can see it's already shows up here. So it reloads it automatically right away. But again, it doesn't actually highlight the whole power of React. React, as I mentioned before, obviously is all about having it being composable. So let me quickly show you a few components and how they look like for React. So if we'll go to React.js and we go to community, you can find examples there. And let's say we go to calculator under GitHub, you go to source components. So people usually store components in the component folder, and you'll have components. Usually you name them the way you would use them. So button.js, you would extend React.component, specify properties, have a function called render that will render your component, but still will have ultimately the DOM that renders on the web page. So you split your UI in these individual components, you combine them, but ultimately it's all just JavaScript. But it divides your UI overall in individual components that combined create you in a complex but extremely advanced experience. So that's basically React, the gist of it. And let's get back to React Native. Great to have you back from the demo. Let's now, again, look at the fact that React existed and this idea of learn once, write anywhere, learn React once, learn the concepts of React, of it being declarative, component-based, and bring it over to other operating systems. And that's what led us to creation of React Native. So now we know what React Native is. And but the big thing is always to ask a question, why? Why do we care? Why do we care that React Native is there? Why is it important? And the few points of why I personally believe React Native is important to folks is, again, the same thing. It's declarative, it's component-based, it increases developers' velocity, meaning they become more productive. They don't need to test individual pieces or the entire web app or mobile app they can just test individual components. And also you test them across different platforms, different operating systems. And again, the important thing here is that you write it once using React for React Native, and then you can also have it already built for Android, for iOS, and also different operating systems like tvOS or Windows or macOS. The community is growing, the different operating systems are supported, and so it's extremely portable with you just writing it once. But more practically, I basically use the same things we mentioned on our website, on the React Native website here. If you can look at the website, you will have a showcase page, which is great. It has a big list of different companies, large or small, where we don't just list apps that use React Native, but we also have some links to articles that engineering teams behind those apps have written so far about their experience with React Native. And you can find it on this URL, the showcase page. And again, there are many more applications that use it, not just Facebook apps like Facebook app or Ads Manager or Oculus. There are many more like Discord, Shopify, and those folks actually wrote a couple articles, as I mentioned. Shopify recently published one, 2020, about React Native and its use in their team. Tableau shared their experience as well, and Discord too. And also recently Business Insider published a great article discussing what's the importance of React Native being to the community, to the industry, and what sort of salaries people have been getting as they get more and more experience and hands-on practice with React Native. So I believe the community and the space has been growing rapidly. So now we know why React is important, why we need to discuss React Native here to begin with. But let's see React Native in action a bit. And that's where we'll transition to developing with React Native. And I believe that may be one of the most exciting parts of today's presentation for many. So React Native demo, I'll give you a short demo first of what React Native looks like, and I hope you can connect it with the previous demo for React. So let's get started. Let's take a look. So to show you React Native, or at least 101, like hello world example of React Native, rather than building it on my local machine, which I'll do later in the presentation, I want to show you what, again, the React Native.dev allows you to do right on the website. So on the home page, if you go to, you can see on the left, it's exactly the code you would write with React, as I showed you React example a few minutes ago. So you have return of the hello world app. You specify a view. View is a component that React Native has, one of the core components. Specify its style, where it's located, and some text. If you were to look on Android, that's how it will look like on Android. You press a button. If you want to see how it looks like on iOS, it looks exactly the same. It gets converted, and I'll explain what it means and how it works later in the talk. But overall, you can see that I use this code that exactly how I would write it with React, but with just some components that I have to learn and work with. And this hello world, I think, is a good representation of what React Native is. But an important thing for you to keep in mind for later on is this Expo allows you to connect your device and run this app on your machine, on your phone, whether it's iOS or Android, by just scanning this QR code with the Expo Go app, and you can test it on your real device. There's also a web that you can see kind of loading for a while, but there's actually a working example that I'll show later in the presentation too. So overall, this is how it works, and I think it's extremely well explained here on this web page too. But overall, again, this is what I wanted to show, and I'll show you how to build React Native on the local machine later in the talk. It's great to have you back here. So after the demo, let's now step back for a second and figure out how to actually work with React Native, because I had everything set up already and prepared for me to work with React Native. But let's take a closer look what it was actually. Dev environments that you are working as a developer for React Native, there are two main things to know. There's Expo CLI, the command line interface that people find extremely useful, and there's also React Native CLI too. If I were to discuss Expo CLI first, because that's the one many people are most familiar with, Expo CLI is basically, in general, it's better for new mobile developers, people who are new to the space, people who'd like to get started quickly. Again, it's extremely fast to begin developing using Expo, especially if it's the most common use cases, like you're using and relying on plenty of built-in core components that React Native provides to you. If you want to rely on the build control from the Expo CLI itself, Expo CLI is a great choice because there's also no extra need for you having IDEs like for Xcode or Android Studio. You still need the emulator to run those apps for Android or iOS, but you don't actually need the IDEs installed. But still, in terms of some disadvantages, and the website, React Native website, goes into lengthy discussion of what to choose. Again, Expo CLI has a limited capability in managing working with native modules, which I will touch base on later on in this presentation. And I'll give you a quick showcase of what Expo is and capabilities it can give you. Again, it's great for not just using emulators, you can also scan a QR code and have the mobile app running on your actual phone. You can install app for Expo. And also there is a snack capability, as they call it, basically have the instance of your app on web as well. So I'll give you a quick showcase right now. As I mentioned, Expo CLI is extremely powerful piece of software that allows you to build your projects. And for that, it's extremely useful for development because you don't need much to be able to run it and get started quickly. So if you go to expo.dev, you can find a lot of documentation, explanation on what they do and how to install it in your machine. But more precisely and actually explain why it's important, if you go again to React Native website, you'll find a few quick starts under environment setup, one for React Native CLI and one for Expo CLI. And it explains you exactly the same thing, how to initialize using Expo, how to install the CLI to begin with. And let's say you have an app, you can actually expose it for web using expo.dev. It's something called snack, where you can find an example of your app. Similarly, how you could see those examples on the introduction page here. The same way the snack, and actually it's all snacks, as they called. It lets you to host it here on the web, to share it with your teammates. Again, you can scan this QR code to have a different instance of this app running on your real phone. You can see it for iOS, for Android, and even for the web. For the web, it works really well with something called Create React Native App, which I'll show later on. But again, expo.dev is an extremely important piece of software that really can get you started quickly with React Native. So I highly encourage you to give a try and go to this expo.dev or start with going to setting up your development environment on reactnative.dev. But yeah, that's about all. So let's get back to our presentation. Now let's take a look at React Native CLI. So React Native, I'm not going to go into many details there. Again, the website, React Native website, has plenty of explanation when to choose what, but React Native is a bit more complex in terms of you actually starting to use it, but it gives you a lot more control over your dependencies, over your build, and also your native modules. So take a look at explanation what React Native CLI is on the website, and I'm not gonna go into too many details. Today I'll talk about Expo CLI and use Expo CLI the most. So now we have our dev environment ready. So what's next though? More React Native, fortunately. And the first thing is the important concept to understand throughout this whole discussion is the idea of native components versus React Native core components. So to explain you what the native components are and how they would be related to React Native core components, I really like this illustration that's like it is on React Native website. But basically here on the left and on the right, you can see the different versions for different operating systems, Android on the left and iOS on the right, that's basically been built with React Native, but just created independently for these two operating systems. Visually, they are the same, basically, apart from operating system defined location of nav menu, top for the Android and bottom for iOS, and it gives you name of native components, native for Android, for example, for the image called image view, and native for iOS UI image view. For text on Android, it's text view, native component, and UI text view for iOS. If it was React Native core components, image view or UI image view would have been called just image, or text view or UI text view is just called text. Basically, you only write text, you only write image, and then it gets converted into the native components for individual operating system, Android or iOS. To give again better explanation, this table again from the same web page on React Native core components called view, on Android view or iOS it will be called view group or UI view, text for React Native, text view for Android, UI text view for iOS, and even web analog as well if you want to compare to the web as well. And it has a quick description, just a couple of examples to give you understanding of what and how React Native actually works. You're writing it in the React Native way, and it then just converts it to representation to an analog of iOS, Android, or web, or whatever else you might be writing your code for. So that's basically the gist of it. That's an important concept to keep in mind. The difference between what you're writing for React Native and what native components look like. React Native building components that you can also find on the website, well described. It's their core components to understand. There are properties, core properties that React Native has, and objects. So let's take a look at core components really briefly. The core components, there are basic ones, there are user interface core components, list views, and also operating system specifics. Because obviously you can't just expect to write React Native for everything and expect it to one-to-one translate to different operating systems. Sometimes you have to write operating system specific code. And there are also components for that with React Native. And for all of that, again, the website has a great live playgrounds, and I'd like to give you a quick showcase of that too. Alrighty, so again, if we are on React Native.dev and go to Components tab, you'll be able to navigate to a couple of things. One of them is core components. It's the component that are, again, come along with the React Native and you can use in your apps. There are some basic ones like image, text, view, text input, and many others that you would obviously, you might most likely have in majority of apps out there, React Native based or not. There are more complex ones, again, that will be user interface relies on, like button or switch, list views, which is extremely important because the reality is majority of mobile apps that are feed-based, data-based are relying on list views. And as I mentioned, there are also some iOS-specific components because people who use individual operating systems like that, iOS or Android, they have expectations. Have expectations of when nav menu is located, how button look like, what permissions to use, and you do have to work with them. And React Native provides you that support. And there's some other examples as well, like alert, activity indicator. So let's take a look at one of those components. And again, thanks to Snack, Expo.dev, you can see that used by seeing this example, how the button can be utilized with React Native, what needs to be supplied. Again, the website it just has so much information for you to get started, different states, different properties, all very well defined, very well explained. You go to text, the same thing. You can see how it is like in this Snack example too for Android or iOS or something else. So extremely useful, and that's how core components look like. Now let's take a look at properties. Properties, again, there are image style and layout properties, there are shadow properties, text, and view properties. But enough talking about them and even like listing them here. The more importantly, and again, that's why I really like the website that the team built for React Native, is that you can see that all in action right there with the interactive playground on the website. So let's again take a look at these properties in action on React Native website. Looked at core components before, now let's look at properties. And in properties, as I mentioned, are different types that React Native comes with. Again, you can see them in the use and this playground from the snack.expo.dev. The trends are right here, shows how it looks like for Android and iOS. So you can test it right here or your device. You can even remove this whole thing if it actually bothers you and you want to just focus on writing in your browser. So you can do that too. And again, you can see how those properties work and even change them as well. So, and even more detailed examples with Flexbox. Flexbox becomes extremely important when you go into styling of your app. I'm not going to go into those details for today's presentation, but if you want to really know about styling, Flexbox is what also covered on React Native.dev. So we look at properties. Now, last but not least, object types that React Native has built in. Layout event and press events, React node, Rect, and also view token. These object types, again, let's take a look at them in action on the React Native website really quickly. Object types. As I mentioned, there are a couple of different types. There is a press event, React node, Rect, view token, many others, and it explains you where that object might be coming out of, what kind of callback, and you can see an example here, what those values represent. And because the list is quite short, if you were to Google any of these object types, you'll have plenty of results and explanations outside of this website too. So I highly encourage you, if you're ever stuck, to also go to one of those community forums to ask questions about using this particular object type. But please do read documentation first. Okay, so we talked about all those things, the core component properties and object types for React Native. Now, bring it all together. And again, I really like this correlation or similarity with React. If you've been using React, you might have heard of create React app project that lets you get started with React fairly quickly. It's basically boilerplate code with some templates that let you quickly begin working with React. The same has been created for React Native. And so there is a project called React Native app that you can go to GitHub for on the Expo GitHub org. And using that example, that project, I'll basically give you a quick demo of what React Native is, a bit more elaborate than the previous example. And again, if I already clone that and use this tool, but basically if you have the React Native, create React Native app, it will allow you to name it, then choose what kind of template you want to use, choose what specifications you want, like custom font, authentication, what else, and also what you want to run it for, whether it's for web, Android, and iOS. So again, it's fairly straightforward in terms of how to get started with that, but I already have it all enabled. So let's get started and take a look at how it is like in action. Quick demo here. So as I mentioned, Create React Native app is an extremely useful piece of software, open source projects that's been done in collaboration between Facebook and Expo, and it's been originally shared in 2017 on a blog on React Native. But so if you were to go to GitHub, Expo/Create React Native app, and as I said, it helps you to create your apps for iOS, Android, and web for React Native. And you can see it's extremely popular. So let's get started. The only thing we really need is to run this operation. And I gave you a quick example, just again showed this graphics, this GIF in the previous slide. But let me actually use it in my terminal and show you how it works like looks like in reality. So after I paste it, I have to name my app. I'm not gonna be extremely smart, so I'm gonna use default new app. It will start working with dependencies and so all sorts of things. So I'm gonna put you on pause right now and get back after it's all done, so you don't have to wait around. All right, all great. Now, after we installed all the dependencies, actually take a look at the code. Let me open my VS Code, so you can see that it's not just our source files like app.js, that again you can see how it looks like. You have a function app, main function, which defines the view, text, the status bar, and it right away already initialized for me Android and iOS builds. So you can see that CocoaPods are used for iOS and Gradle for Android to actually build. So it's all been generated for me for this first example app. So let's say I wanted to actually run it. So now let's actually specify what we want to start. I want to start the web app, the web example of our application. So let me actually open it up. So it will use the Metro bundler to show it to me. So let's see. I want to see how it looks like in a web browser. That's basically the app. I just don't have much. If I had the iOS, it would have allowed me to create iOS. If I had the Android, it would also launch the Android simulator. But in my case, I'm not going to do that. But you can see that with Expo Create App, it allows me to quickly start the app in different operating systems fairly quickly, easily. And there are different operations to start it from the terminal, whether it's iOS, Android, or Expo for the web. So give it a try if you want to see more for React Native. It was a quick demo of React Native with Create React Native app. And what do all apps actually do after they are developed, after they're complete? They break. Everything breaks. So of course the app will also break, whatever app you might have created. And so that's where debugging comes in extremely handy. And so in terms of debugging, it really brings us to the next part of our agenda, debugging. And here Flipper, another Facebook open source project, will come into play and be extremely useful. It's now shipped with React Native, and what Flipper is Extensible Mobile App Debugger. It helps you to visualize, inspect, and control your apps from a simple desktop interface. definition that you can see on the Flipper website. And instead of talking about that, I want to rather give you a quick demo of what Flipper can do for you based on the app that I already have along with the Flipper. So let's take a look. So Flipper is extremely powerful debugger that you can have on your app as a desktop app. Basically, the only thing you have to do is you have to connect it with your emulator, install it fairly quickly. You can have built-in plugins or plugins that you install from a directory and share between your community. You can see that quite a few I can use from the community, and you can build it specifically for your app. In particular, network is extremely important plugin, and it's very well defined under the documentation website. You can see how it works. You can basically see how the requests go back and forth. You can see request for what it is. You can also see logs. Logs, again, extremely useful to see. You can dump them in a file and then scan it elsewhere. And layout, I think that one is one of the most useful ones, because you can see components for what they are, you can even change them and see how it reacts on your app. But really, the most important thing is to connect it with your emulator or whatever else you might be running your app on. It works for Android, iOS, React Native, whatever you might be using Flipper for. So there's a great video about Flipper, as I said, where we give a demo of what Flipper looks like. I recorded previously. Basically, I had an app to test, built with component kit. You can see that using the layout manager, I can see for individual elements in a component. There is even a custom plugin you can use. As I said, network inspector is very useful too. You can see requests as they come in, as they fail. You can fail them using one of the example apps that come along with React with Flipper. So give it a try, take a look. If you want to build your own, there's actually a great tutorial here on creating plugins. So thank you. Let's get back to the presentation. You can see why Flipper is so powerful and great to use. Now, if you want to see more about Flipper, there is I believe I'm biased, but there is a great video on the Facebook open source YouTube channel, part of our Explain Like I'm 5 series, where we give a short overview of our projects, and we gave an overview of Flipper in the past as well. So even more in debugging, again, the website. React Native has so much information, and debugging is part of the topics they cover in length. And Flipper is just one way to deal with mobile apps and React Native mobile apps, and you can find a lot more other ways to debug it. So we're done with debugging. So how do we catch future breaks? We can't just constantly debug things. Testing helps us to catch any failures, bugs, issues, and concerns. And that again brings us to the next agenda item, testing. Testing, again, it's greatly overviewed on the React Native website. But one thing in particular, again, Jest, that gets shipped with React Native, it's built in. But Jest is another Facebook open source project that help people test. It's a JavaScript testing framework with a focus on simplicity. What it means is that, again, the Jest website is also amazing. With almost zero configuration, especially if you're using React Native, it's already built in, you can have something more complex type of testing, not just unit and integration tests. You can have snapshot tests where you render part of your UI, your component, you save it as a snapshot, and you validate it later. But I'm not going to go into details for that. But it's also something Jest is capable of. It's extremely fast. It gives you great output. You can also use it as a code coverage tool and go into more advanced techniques like mocking. Exception handling, as I said, is extremely descriptive, and it also has a great autocomplete. To give you an example, just take a closer look at Jest. Again, similar as you were to write a test, you would start with a test keyword, you would name your test case, you would have expect clause, and then you do the assertion. Obviously, true is truthy, so that will pass, and when it passes, it gives you this output. It tells you how long it took, how many snapshots, no snapshots, regular test, and what the test was. So nothing special there. In terms of more complex, let's say you're trying to test a function, you initialize a test suite, functions, you have a test case, which you initialize by using it function, and you name your test case at 3 plus 3, and it equals to 6, and you validate that. And again, it passes, nothing special, 3 plus 3 is 6. But let's say something went wrong and the function broke. So instead of 3 plus 3 giving you 6, it will give you something else. And the test would have caught it. It will tell you that it received 7 rather than 6 as you expected, and I believe it's fairly descriptive thing for folks to find in their test cases, and from there on you can actually fix it. And also again, the auto completion of test cases, so basically writing test code with Jest, is extremely powerful, and you can see that how many other functions it allows you to use. And if you again, when you want to see more about Jest, there is an ELI 5 video from on our channel at Facebook open source YouTube channel. Alrighty, we covered everything on the agenda, so many different things. So what's next? And so what's next is actually been published already on the React Native website's blog. It's the React Native many platform vision. And what it involves is respecting the platforms. Instead of fighting with how the platform's individual operating systems work, trying to work with them, work with the constraints that the platform imposes, work with expectations that the users have. Android users or iOS users have expectations of how buttons look like, how UI looks like, how navigation menu is positioned. Instead of circumventing that and just have another layer of complexity, we're trying to work with them, with the platforms. And also expanding to new platforms. You might have heard already that React Native has been used to build desktop versions of a messenger for both macOS and Windows. And again, React Native is now you can use for building desktop apps. And we're also working with AR/VR teams at Oculus or Facebook Reality Labs, as we call it, on using React Native there as well. So really you can see how that new vision is expanding for us too, for the whole community. And if you want to read more about it, it's been extensively shared and explained in this React Native's many platform vision that you can find on a blog on React Native website. And I highly encourage you to take a look. So what about the React Native community? I can't talk about open source project like React or any project for that matter without touching base on the community itself. And I highly encourage you to join them. They are awesome. They're great. And React Native community, in terms of things that you might consider and why you might consider joining, is that getting help, you can get help in many different ways from the community. You can go to the GitHub issues where you can have a template for asking a question or raising a concern that you might have. There are also Stack Overflow, fairly active Q&A discussions going on as well around React Native. You can also keep yourself up to date with the news around React Native using React Twitter account. You can follow them, or React Native account for React Native specific ones. React also shares React Native news, but I highly recommend you following both. And if you want to be part of the community space where discussions actually happen, go to Reactiflux community on reactiflux.com. There are some spaces for React folks, for React Native, and many more projects that you might find yourself extremely handy and helpful to you to find information, ask questions, and just engage with the community. There's also a Facebook group you can find handy for React Native and many other channels as well. And last but not least, contributing back. Again, it's well discussed and outlined in the contributors guide on the React Native GitHub repo. You can find they go to things that you should be cautious of, like code of conduct, but also gives you great first issues labels you can use to find things to tackle first. But again, React Native website has a community tab where you can find all the information I just covered here about the community, that support they can give you, and the help that you can provide to the community, how you can contribute back. So let's summarize everything that we've talked about today, and we've talked about so many things. Call to action. I always like to end my presentation with call to action. Visit React Native website. You might have noticed the amount of information and the things that website provides to you, and we highly encourage you to go there. Join the React Native community. Ask a question. Contribute back. People will welcome you. It's extremely welcoming community, extremely friendly community. And continue learning. Again, beyond this presentation, there's so much content. You can find some on the React Native website, by the way, or you can even go to our YouTube channel, as I mentioned before, and there is Explain Like I'm 5 series. We covered React Native in the past, and we'll definitely will talk more in the future. So I highly encourage you to give it a try and listen to videos and watch the videos that we have on our YouTube channel. But overall, thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Dmitry Vinnik. You can find me on Twitter. go to my blog, LinkedIn, or email me directly with any questions or anything you'd like to discuss. So thank you.